Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of the Biodiversity podcast by Teasels. And this morning I'm joined by the one and only, the tree lady, Sharon. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me on this podcast. It's such an important subject right now.
It certainly is. It certainly is. So, Sharon, before we get started and get into the sort of detail, for the uninitiated and for the people that don't know you, do you want to just give us a bit of background on yourself and your professional history?
Yes, so I'm Sharon Durdant-Hollamby and I'm a Chartered Arboriculturist. And that's a bit of a mouthful, hence me saying the tree lady. But I started off in local government as a tree officer in the late 80s and 90s and took a career break for my children and then worked again for Chelmsford City Council as a tree officer between 2000 and 2005. And I left there to work for a contracting company. And initially I was going to manage the tree surgeons, but I was rubbish at it. I kept making them hot chocolate and listening to stories of their love life. I wasn't very good at that. So the owner said, I think you should start up a consultancy practice. So we did that together and formed a company which I ran for 10 years of ecologists, arboriculturists and landscape architects. And I left that and formed my current company 5 years ago, or 5.5 years ago now, which is a consultancy practice that provides advice to mainly within the planning and construction industry on how we can look at trees carefully and look after them during development. That's the core of my work, but I'm also the Vice President of the Institute of Chartered Foresters, which is my professional body. So that's me in a nutshell.
Nice. Okay, so one thing I wanted to pick up on, the main body of your work is working with developers, working with architects on how you can protect trees on construction sites. So at what stage do you get involved in that process? Are you there from the beginning? Are you sort of the afterthought at the end? Does it kind of vary?
That's a really good question. So when I started off in 2005 in private practice, the British standard that relates to this type of work, which is called BS 5837, really was just a new iteration was released. And at that stage, it did say in the document, you need to be there at the beginning. After the topographical survey, the arboriculturalist and the ecologist need to get in there early. And sometimes it happened and sometimes it didn't. And over that 10 years I managed that practice, I created a chart. And that chart was at what stage in the process were we engaged? And at the beginning, we were engaged. They're just about to put in a planning application. Quick, we need one of them arboricultural reports. Can you do it quick, love? And then as time went on, we got instructed earlier and earlier. In my current business, I'm nearly always instructed right at the beginning. And that's important because what an arboriculturalist does, when you visit sites, you look at the quality of the trees. You look at how big they are, take all sorts of measurements, their trunk, the branches, the height of the tree. You look at what species they are. You look at how big they're likely to grow. And you look at their health and condition. So you're looking at the structure of the tree. Are there any big cavities? Is there a big split? Is it leaning heavily for the first time, which we can normally tell? And we look at the health of the tree. Are there enough leaves for that type of tree at that time of year? Are the leaves green or the right colour for that species? Are there any fungi on the tree? And if so, does that matter? And these are all clues, and we call it body language, the structure and the physiology of the tree. And
who was the guy? The body language of the trees. Who was the guy who wrote the book?
Dr. Klaus Mattach. So it's all about what trees tell us about what's going on with them. They can't speak for themselves. So it's a job of an arboriculturalist to really determine that. So we measure all of that, we record all of that. And finally, we give the tree a grading system. it's A, B, C, or U. So to take you through that, an A quality tree is what you might just got a fabulous healthy tree and lots of people can see it. Or maybe it's really scarce, maybe it's a really rare variety, or maybe it's a veteran tree and it's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years and it may have loads of structural faults, but that's part of its intrinsic character.
Yeah.
The second is B, and that's a tree of moderate quality, and that's a pretty good tree. And often people can see it as well, but not necessarily so.
Yeah.
A C grade tree is something that it might be absolutely fine, but it might be small, it might be have a lower vitality than we'd expect, or minor defects, and perhaps not so important in the landscape. And the U category trees are unsuitable for attention. They might be dead or dying or dangerous or some other issue, or growing in a space that it can't possibly achieve its maximum potential because, say, it's right next to a building.
Yeah.
So we do that survey, and the idea of the survey is to give it to the design team. Yeah. And we give that information in the form of a table and a series of plans. I personally produce a coloured plan, which I very seriously call it my coloured blob plan. So that sort of takes that initial survey a bit further, and it's an at-a-glance guide produced in a computer format that architects use to plan how the buildings will be laid out on that site. Yeah. Now, arboriculture is really important, and so is ecology for biodiversity, and so is landscape architecture. But there are also other factors at play: flood risk, soil contamination, levels, the housing need. I mostly work, well, I would say 50% of my work is for social housing in London. Yeah. And so, you know, there's a huge amount of conflicting issues, drainage, highways, but getting in there early, I've noticed, has made a real difference. And from that data, eventually a layout is produced, and that layout bounces around the different team members. Is it going to work? What about shading? Okay, we can keep that tree, but when it grows up, is it going to really cause so much shading to that house there's going to be constant pressure to prune it? Or does that matter? Actually, that thought process is somewhat changing in the light of climate change. Or is there going to be room to park cars? Is there going to be room to build on that site? Because it's not just about where the houses and roads are going to go. It's also about, we've got to be realistic. They need to have site welfare huts. There needs to be contractor parking. And there needs to be room to swing a piling rig, as it very much were. So all of those are really complex. And once we've all agreed a scheme between us, and there may be compromises on both sides, there may be issues of viability.
Because that's what I was going to say. I guess within that springs to mind. I guess within a design team, you've got to. It appears that everybody's got to have a very, in many ways, have sort of quite a few frank conversations and be able to compromise and be able to talk openly about, well, if you put this tree 2 millimeters away from from the trunk, you're going to have issues. And do you know what I mean? I guess there's got to be a lot of give and take within that design team.
Absolutely, that's a very good point, and that's something that is improving all the time. One of the things that the design tool that we use with that coloured blob plan I spoke about earlier, which is really called a tree information plan, that also has root protection areas of those trees plotted on there. And that's a mathematical calculation which estimates the sort of soil volume needed for that tree, and we might modify that to what's actually going on in the ground. And I've noticed that over the last 15 years that I've been working in consultancy, that is respected more. But in terms of compromise, there is an issue of viability as well. And sometimes it might be that we have to make a difficult decision about, say, some B category trees. Yeah. I never sacrifice an A category tree. You know, I say to them, the way that I approach this is I say to my client, whatever you wish and you want, you've got to get a planning decision on this. And no matter what you think about my advice, and I have to say it's pretty favourable most of the time, you won't get it through planning. And I say to them, if I feel that things are getting a bit uncomfortable, I say to them, I'm here to guide you through the planning process. I'm a consultant to help you achieve planning consent with the other team members. So I can tell you now that if you lose that tree because of the layout, it's going to be a massive stumbling block.
Yeah.
Even if the local authorities say, fair enough, we don't mind, increasingly the opinion, and quite rightly so, of members of the public are really holding a lot more political sway.
Yes.
So even if at officer level it's deemed acceptable, we do see a rising pressure groups to say, no, you can't take that out, blah, blah, blah. So any consultant of whatever discipline is there to support their clients in achieving a good biodiverse design that gets through planning and meets with the needs of the local community. So the document that we produce is called an Arboricultural Impact Assessment. Yeah. And then it goes through planning, and that's another whole story.
Yeah, I can imagine we could, but you talk about the sort of the pressure, you know, the political pressure from the public about losing notable trees, and I mean, it goes without saying how trees can be such an important element of any landscape, but especially within perhaps the urban landscape. And I perhaps think, you know, the pressure of, you know, especially cities with the heat island effect.
Yes.
And how that has a direct impact on our tree species. I mean, do you want to give us a bit of sort of background on that? Because I think perhaps the days of, I don't know, planting I'm paraphrasing, but planting a Betula jackmontii or a Betula pendula in a pavement and expecting it to do well, perhaps are over, considering climate change, or?
Yes. People are thinking much deeper about two things. One is tree numbers. So I know it's not quite the point you're making, but I think it's relevant to begin with. Until probably 5 years ago, people talked about replacing tree numbers with, say, fell one tree, we're going to plant 2 new trees. That's not a bad way, but increasingly it's about canopy cover. And that's really relevant to the heat island effect you referred to. Yeah. So there are some excellent canopy cover assessments and that means somebody looking down at a bird's eye view in 2 dimensions of what amount of land is covered by tree canopies. And there's been, all over the country, there's been some excellent studies by something called iTree, which if people are interested in this, who are listening to the podcast, they could go on to, and this is a dyslexic's nightmare because I am dyslexic, tree economics, all one word. So you've got 3 E's going on together there, I think. And if you look at their case studies, you can see that there are numerous studies, and there's a fantastic one in London, and more recently, there's one in Islington. You can go on to you can look at iTree studies, which is a 2-dimensional canopy cover assessment, and it's much more than that. It actually looks at the ecosystem services those trees provide. It looks at how much pollution they mitigate, how much dust they grab, how much surface water runoff is absorbed by trees, all the myriad of benefits that trees provide. And that also looks at the species composition as well. So going back to the hub of your question, which was, are the days of planting Betula jackmontii in pavements over? Well, if it's not appropriate to do so, then yes, it is. But I think we need to understand what we have first. I think that we need to see what the local tree population is to help us inform what to plant next. And also, we need to be very open-minded for non-native species because our climate is changing. And so a lot of tree officers, and Hackney is a very good example of this. It's basically a public arboretum in the streets. So the tree officer there, Rupert Bentley Walls, and actually there's good work in Islington and other boroughs as well, have really used their imagination of planting species which are not commonly seen, but are thriving in these heat island urban situations and providing flowers and fruit and really increasing the biodiversity, but it's not traditionally native. That's changing.
So
they also have a filtering effect for particulate pollution, and so do hedges. Now imagine a hedge next to a busy road in a town, or the pollution that's coming off the car hits the hedge and is partially absorbed and then partially pushed up higher than the people walking by. Trees are also, and hedges and all vegetation, act as sponges. So we've had some really heavy downfalls lately. I mean, this has been recorded at the end of August. And so the trees absorb the rain water and they slow its flow down, acting as sponges, directing it down the trunk. And then once it gets to the roots themselves and all the soil around the roots holds the water and slows down. So we see a lot less flooding, flash flooding, and that's being used in a macro scale actually as part of flood intervention in rural areas in Yorkshire, for example, with mass tree planting there. It's nature's way of just managing that. And trees also have this measurable physiological benefit. And I don't say that lightly. There have been numerous studies where people's blood pressure, for example, has been taken in areas with trees and without trees, showing the benefits of that. And the slowing down and the fact that even the brain recognizes the beauty of nature and has a calming effect on the primeval part of the brain compared to, say, concrete buildings. So trees have a multitude, and obviously I haven't mentioned because it's the benefits to wildlife. So we have the benefits of invertebrates feeding and living on the trees, invertebrates pollinating the trees. We have birds who are feeding on the trees, their fruit. We have birds who are living on the trees. And we also have woodpeckers who break down decayed trees. Then we have small mammals who, squirrels are actually a bit of a problem if there's too many of them, but I'm not going to enter that debate here, who feed on, small mammals may feed on the nuts that the trees produce or the fruit. We have what's really fascinating is fungi, and this is biodiverse podcast, so may I talk about fungi?
You with overwhelming pleasure. Crack on, I'd love to hear it.
Well, trees are a host for a myriad of different fungi, which is a good thing, which is part of our ecosystem. So we have fungi that live on leaves and in leaves. We have, I didn't even mention caterpillars eating leaves, by the way. Well, anyway, this is a chat. So we have fungi that live on leaves, live in leaves. We have fungi that live in the wood, and we have fungi that live on and in the roots. So to go into fungi that live in the wood, the tree has many fungi in it, and it's part of a community. It's almost like its own ecosystem. And those fungi, it's almost like, do you ever watch Robot Wars? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So the fungi might be competing with another type of fungi. And this has been shown in studies, and they put up a barrier against each other, and then eventually environmental conditions within the tree might favor one fungi more than the other, and then that other fungi might take over, and mostly this is all in harmony. And actually what can happen though with some fungi is actually do cause a tree to decay quite quickly. Now in an open field or in a wood, that's actually fine. So the tree might fall, it will rot down, it will create soil for new trees to grow and enrich the soil for all of the soil fauna and flora and mycorrhizae. But actually in an urban area, that's a problem. We can't have a rotten tree falling on a parked car or on a pedestrian. So within the tree, we've got the fungi, and then on the roots, we have fungi growing in and on the roots. And that's the word mycorrhizae, which people are beginning to know a bit more about. Wow, that's fascinating. So we now know that mycorrhizae link with other trees, mycorrhizae. And we have this enormous network. And through this network, trees communicate with each other. Now, that's not me being a tree hugging hippie here. It's actually scientifically proved.
Yes, 100%.
So imagine you're an oak tree and a caterpillar comes along and has a chomp at your leaves. Now, I don't want all my leaves chomped. I need them to photosynthesize. So I'm going to turn on the chemical that makes my leaves taste horrid. And so that turning on that chemical is communicated through roots to nearby oak trees. They go, we're onto a trap, mate. We've got to turn on our chemical. So you might say, why isn't that chemical turned on all the time? Well, I imagine it's expensive for the tree. There might be other reasons as well. Trees also support each other in a woodland. So there's talk of mother trees who share their resources, their nutrients. The other thing that the mycorrhizae and the tree roots do is mycorrhizae increases the surface area of the root for the tree. So it increases its ability to take up water and nutrients. And what the mycorrhizae want in return is a little bit of the sugar that the tree makes. So it's a truly symbiotic relationship. And for mycorrhizae to thrive, we need healthy soils. And often our soils are not healthy. And I would suggest to you that the most important thing in biodiversity is soil health. Without soil health, we're not going to get the proliferation of ground flora, trees. Trees are struggling. Often you see lonely trees planted in a pit in a street looking sad. Well, wouldn't you be sad if you're on your own? They need their friends. And that's why we're keen to have groups of trees planted together and good soil. Some urban soils are impoverished for a number of reasons. One is we're just too damn tidy. People sweep up the leaves and they can't rot down and feed the soil. The other reason is trees are often in hard surfaces, so you just don't get that nutrient recycling. That's so important. The other thing is urban soils can be very alkaline because of what's been built around them, or I do a lot of digging up in London, and there's just layers upon layers of rubble through decades, and it raises the soil pH. And there may be other reasons that soils are dug up and disturbed all the time, so you lose that layer. Rural soils tend to be better. In agricultural fields, high intensive arable farming, there are a lot of products used to produce a high yield, and it does change the soil characteristics. So we need healthy soils for our biodiversity.
Yeah, and I think that can sort of get lost, but it all does, whether we're talking about trees, whether we're talking about, any other any other plant type, it starts from the soil. I don't know.
It does.
But again, it's less tangible, isn't it? Because, you what's the old statistics? In a square centimetre of soil, you've got 7 billion bacteria species, 50 kilometers of mycorrhizal fungi, but you can't see it. Therefore, it's less tangible than seeing biodiversity above ground and visible species. But
out of sight, out of mind. But soil is going to be where it's at in the next 20 years. We're all going to be talking about it because we damage our soil at our peril.
Yeah, so soils really do get forgotten about, don't they? Or can get forgotten about because they're less tangible. But perhaps to a similar point, it's nice to see that the new agricultural policy, the new agricultural bill, there's more emphasis on, public money for public good. But part of that is soil restoration. It's
absolutely. And it's also going to be interesting about how these rewilding experiments go as well. I mean, that's a whole new topic, perhaps not for this podcast, but may I go on to managing soils on construction sites?
I would love you to, yes.
Yeah, so we talked earlier about the process to take a scheme through to planning. And just to go back to that briefly, after the planning decision, there's often a condition for a really technical report that works in tremendous detail with all the different consultants. And that's an arboricultural method statement. And that really sets out how things can be done, including protecting the soil around trees. And then that must be taken forward to practice on site. So part of my job and the job of other arboriculturists is to actually go on to construction sites. That's and to see if what we said was going to happen is happening. And one of the key elements of that is a tree protection fence.
Yeah. And
that's a really strong fence that protects the root protection area. So normally, in an ideal world, beyond branches. Now, if there isn't room, I talked earlier about the need to sort of walk around a site, drive around a site. There's some fantastic ground protection that you can put down, which stops the soil from being compacted. Because compaction of soil is where something drives over it and squashes the air pockets out of the soil. And that means that the water won't go down as well. It may even not go down at all. And that also means that the tree roots, those fine hair-like roots and mycorrhizae, cannot respire. And I think people often forget that tree roots need to breathe underground as well as above ground. That's all part of photosynthesis. So that's really relevant to soil health and tree management and biodiversity, is that things are really looked after properly.
So to that point, so you are, your role once the construction build happens is you're going there. I mean, perhaps it will vary from site to site, but you perhaps going there on a weekly basis, you going there on a fortnightly basis?
Not that frequently. It tends to be it depends what's happening on the site. If nothing much is happening, about once every couple of months. But then we go there for a special visit if we're, say, I'm writing a really complicated report right now about putting underground services near some trees. So I'll be going there then to make sure that causes minimum harm, or putting a building in near a tree where it requires specialist foundation methods. So when something really special and complicated happens, we go. And again, that's something that's improving over the last 15 years. So I've always had a good presence on site, but sometimes we are ignored. And it's still a problem with some developers, some smaller developers perhaps, but it's increasingly in the minority. So disasters still happen, and disasters happen incredibly quickly as well. So you can have the best report in the world showing exactly what's going to happen. And then if nobody reads it, it's a waste of time. It's just a cynical box ticking exercise. And then a tree's root system can be damaged very quickly in a few minutes, particularly on a clay soil, by heavy machinery driving underneath, by people mixing cement and pouring it underneath a tree. These things do sometimes still happen, and one trying very hard to stop that, but thankfully in the minority.
But correct me if I'm wrong, the old British standard said chestnut pale fencing around a tree to 1.5. Now the last update I was aware of, the protective fencing is really protective fencing, isn't it?
Really protective fencing. So it's mostly something called Harris panels, which are these wire mesh panels that are supported by diagonal scaffold poles or struts going in towards the tree, so you can't move them. And that's actually quite a common situation, as the developer will put the fencing up and say, cool, I've done it then, it looks fabulous. And I said, well, you haven't supported it. And the reason why that's important is that people can lift the panels and move them because they're in the way. But it is an improving situation with work to do.
That's good. So Sharon, I'm conscious of your time, and I think me and you could talk trees, mycorrhizal fungi.
Yeah.
I really actually wanted to talk about, the research. I think, wasn't it the research from Cardiff University about?
Yes.
Yeah,
that's right. That's from Dr. Limbody or Professor Limbody, I should say.
So Sharon, so where can people, so like I say, I'm conscious of your time and we could talk for hours. So, but before you go, do you just want to give the listeners a sort of an understanding of where they can find you, sort of, so Twitter, LinkedIn, that type of thing? So.
Yep, that's fine. So on Twitter, I'm at the Tree Lady 67.
Excellent.
So we found there, and my full name is Sharon Durdant-Hollamby on LinkedIn, and I have a company called Sharon Hosegood Associates, and on there you can see some of our community work that we've carried out as well. And there's a link to a tree radar page on someone else's company called treeradar.co.uk. So we haven't talked about that today, but perhaps another time.
I know, I'm just thinking that there is I think there's a part 2 to this somewhere, isn't there? There has to be a part 2 to this, because you know, we've touched on so many subjects, but I think we could perhaps at a later date we could perhaps dive into some some of the subjects in a bit more detail, perhaps.
Great, thank you very much for inviting me.
Nice one. Cheers, Sharon. Bye bye.
Thank you. Okay.